There's a man back here.
Oh, so it's hard. All right, so we'll use the microphones.
Okay, Dr. Paul Gelner is the author of Emotional Communication, Countertransference Analysis, and the Use of Feeling in Psychoanalytic Technique, and of papers on dreams and child analysis. He's been the director of psychoanalytic education at the Psychoanalytic Psychotherapy Study Center and has taught Northern Rockies Psychoanalytic Institute, Center for Modern Psychoanalytic Studies, and the Colorado Center for Modern Psychoanalysis. He's in private practice in New York City, working with individuals and couples. He specializes in individual and group supervision with psychoanalysts and psychoanalytic psychotherapists. Mary Wallach is in private practice in New York City, where she practices both psychoanalytic and EMDR psychotherapy. She has published papers on poetry and psychoanalysis in the Journal of the American Academy of Psychoanalysis and Dynamic Psychiatry, and has presented on this topic at the PPSC Annex and the Artist Study Group at the William Allenson White Institute. She holds an MFA in writing from Columbia University and has published poetry in a variety of publications. She specializes in working with creative and helping professionals and is available for facilitating poetry reading and writing workshops. So,
Okay. Mary and Paul.
That's
hi.
okay. Am I on? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Just to tell you a little bit about the structure, I'm going to talk first about Hilda Doolittle, who was known as H.D.'s life, and the analysis with Freud, and then Mary is going to be reading selections from the poem and discussing it from a poetic point of view and anything else that she puts into it. We are both not terribly familiar with what the other one has written because we both wanted to keep it spontaneous and to be able to be surprised by each other. It's a pleasure to see so many people out to do something about psychoanalysis a little different than usual. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about a few things. First of all, I'm not an expert on poetry, HD, gender theory, psychosexual development, or any of that stuff. But all of those things come into Freud's analysis of HD, which was a truly unique sort of experience because she was not the type of person that one normally associated with Freud's patients, and he treated her entirely differently, perhaps, than he treated any other patient. And what was really fascinating to me about the whole thing is that what I consider personally to be the absolute weakest part of Freud's work, which is theories of femininity, penis envy, psychosexual development, most of which, I mean, Freud was Freud and there were always moments of brilliance, but most of it was garbage and has been quite destructive to many men and many women. And yet it was a huge part of this analysis, and she ended up being deeply empowered by it, which only goes to show you that when we read things, both historically and theoretically, we don't always understand the context in which they are actually lived out. And regardless of the ideology and the thoughts and all of his theories and her theories, these were two individual people who touched each other very deeply for a very powerful analytic contact. And it really touched me when I first read about her experience with him, and then I ran across the poem that this line, "Woman is Perfect," comes from. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about her life first and then about the analysis. You can feel free to interrupt me at any time. If I find it too distracting, I'll just say so, but it doesn't mean that I don't want to hear the question. We will be discussing things afterward. If there's something that you know more about any of these areas than I do, please feel free to add, correct, or supplement. Okay? And so we will begin. Okay. So Hilda, her name was Hilda Doolittle, okay, and I'll discuss how she came to be known as HD. She was born in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, of a Moravian religious family. Freud made a lot of hay out of the fact that she was born in Bethlehem, as did she, for reasons that we will see. Her mother was a gifted painter and I believe a singer as well. No, her mother couldn't sing, but her grandmother could. And her father was an astronomer who had what she considered to be the strange habit of sleeping during the day so that he could gaze at the stars at night. Okay? And she became an astrologer.
What year was she born?
She was born in 1886, thank you. She was one of 6 children with 5 brothers. She felt that her mother strongly preferred her brothers to her, and that she was a failure, she was a disappointment as a girl and a failure as a boy, and that will get a lot of attention in the analysis. And she said at some point in the analysis she sort of felt like she could only really get attention from her mother when she was sick. She was grew to be a very tall girl and then a tall woman, very stately, very willowy, and this made her both alluring and mysterious to many people and left her feeling absolutely awkward and like a freak inside of herself. And there was a duality that runs through her life, that on the one hand people would experience her as being mysterious, alluring, and goddess-like for reasons that we'll both talk about, and indeed came off, I think, like a kind of arrogant narcissist. And yet she herself was quite shy, quite frightened, and often withdrawn. And I think there was a strong dichotomy between what her social false self was and what her sense of herself was. She met Ezra Pound, the more famous poet than her, when she was 15. He called her Dryad, which was nymph, and he cultivated this sense that she was a nymph, a Greek nymph. And apparently she was also very athletic, so she would be running through the hills of rural Pennsylvania, leaping through the bushes like a Greek goddess. And they were actually engaged for a while. It's not clear to what extent she rejected him or he rejected her, but they remained close throughout his life. They wrote poetry together. They were both interested in ancient Greek poetry and language. She did a lot of work in translation. So she was both writing poetry and she was translating Greek poetry. Sure, yes?
What child was she in the family?
What child was she? I think she was number 4, but I may be wrong.
She was the second oldest by that mother, but there were 2 mothers.
Second, right. There were 2 mothers, and I'm not entirely clear at the moment about who all the brothers were, but their father had a previous marriage.
How did she meet Pound?
I think they were in college together. They grew up in the same town, though. He went to England to make his fame and fortune, and this was all before he became an anti-Semitic fascist lunatic. Okay? Which was, he did all these horrible broadcasts for Mussolini during the Second World War. But prior to that, it sounds like he was he was enterprising, he was an artistic entrepreneur, but he was also extremely encouraging of talent wherever he saw it. And he certainly promoted HD. Now, he left for England, where he launched his career as a poet. Sometime when she was, she was about 15 or 16 at the time. And then she met a girl named Frances Gregg, who became her first lesbian lover. And throughout her life, she was pretty evenly balanced between men and women. And that also came out a lot in the analysis. Her first trip to Europe was also with this woman, Frances Gregg. And then she met Pound there, and she established herself in London. She lived in Europe for the rest of her life, mostly in England at the beginning, primarily in Switzerland at the end. She spent a surprising amount of her life in hotels. She only had apartments and flats for relatively brief periods of time, which was sort of an interesting there's an interesting quality that runs through her life of strong attachments to almost everybody that she came in contact with who didn't reject her. She didn't reject too many people, but people would occasionally be very angry at her for not delivering whatever it was that they thought she should be giving them. But she remained attached to Pound throughout his life, to Frances Gregg until she died, and her subsequent partners as well. A strong steadiness about her attachments. Let's see. Now, describing the whole thing of how she became HD, she started writing poetry with Pound at the time, and he developed a movement and she developed a movement, and they called it Imagism. And she wrote one of her first great poems, one of her poems that was really finished. And I don't know whether she wrote HD at the bottom or he did, but he wrote, at the bottom she wrote HD Imagist, and she went by HD throughout most of her life. She did get married to a man relatively soon after that, whose name was Richard Alderton. And for a few years they led a beautiful, and this was in the years before World War I, leading up to World War I. She led the life of a kind of bohemian artist with, again, male and female lovers. They were married, they were close, and when the war came, everything really fell apart for them. She was becoming a well-known published writer. He did some novels. They shared this interest in Greek. But everything really fell apart for her around the war. He was, I don't think he ever saw battle, but he was stationed in the military. She became pregnant. They had a stillborn child, which was devastating for her. Her father died. One of her brothers died. And their relationship became unfrayed. He fell in love with somebody else. She was sleeping with another man, several other men. She sort of left him and moved to Cornwall. At this point in her life, jealousy was an issue. So on the one hand, she was with another man, became pregnant. They had a horrible back and forth between whether or not he was going to take her back and adopt the child, or whether he was not going to take her back and adopt the child. Eventually, he didn't recognize the child. At which point, a young woman, whose name was Winifred Elsley, but who will be known forever as Briar. She changed her name to Briar after the name of a group of islands off of England that I can't pronounce, so I'm going to call them the Scillies. Does anyone know how they're actually pronounced? Anyway, that was her favorite island, so she named herself after her favorite island. She went up to HD's cottage while HD was pregnant, knocked on the door, apparently fell in love with her immediately. She had been pursuing her, and I think she had read her poetry. And there was some sort of exchange. One of them said, "What is a puffin?" And the other one said, "It's a sea parrot." And they were basically together from that point ever on. Now, at this point, Briar was I think she was an illegitimate daughter of the richest man who had ever lived in England. Okay? And she herself was quite young at the time. I'm trying to remember exactly how young, but something like 17 or 18. And she was high maintenance and moody. And while she fell in love with HD, she apparently very quickly threatened suicide. It is not clear to me why she threatened suicide, but it sounds like it was something along the lines of, "Love me or I will kill myself." And HD was a little distressed by this whole thing, but she made a deal with her. She said, "You are not allowed to threaten to kill yourself anymore, but I will give you my baby. We will raise the child together." Okay? What did she say exactly? Briar said to her, do you mean for my own, exactly like a puppy?" And HD said, "Yes, like a puppy." Okay? So at the beginning, HD was the older woman, but Briar was a very powerful, very controlling, very interesting person. Let me say a little bit more about her before I talk about her relationship. Let's see. She came to write novels. She wrote historical novels. She was apparently the first person to write seriously about film. She and another person that they were involved with edited the first magazine ever about film. She was energetic. She apparently loved to control every second of other people's lives. She was generous. She gave money to the psychoanalytic movement. She supported James Joyce. She gave money to the Scottsboro Boys and to the NAACP in the United States. Her father, as I said, was the richest man who had ever lived in England. He was in shipping. When he died, she inherited about a third of the wealth. And so she was fixed throughout life. She would probably be today considered to be a trans man. She never cross-dressed, but apparently she was terribly resentful that she was born a girl and very angry that she wasn't a boy. And when H.D. showed Freud a picture of her, he took a look at her and said, yes, she is all boy, isn't she? So while she didn't cross-dress, she did apparently use the masculine pronoun throughout. And she told H.D. to never think of her as a woman, to always think of her as a man. And once they were together, they really stayed together forever. They traveled extensively at the beginning. They went to Greece. They went all over Europe. Breyer paid for everything, and from this point on, pretty much supported H.D. Let's see here. Anyway, and about the time of H.D.'s daughter's birth, her name was to be Perdita, which I think means lost.
Lost, yeah.
Okay. She got the Spanish flu, like so many people did at the end of World War I. H.D. did. She had double pneumonia with the flu, and they thought that both of them would die. It was a near-death experience. And apparently she was on the way out. Breyer came. The landlady asked Breyer who was going to pay the bill if H.D. died, sweetheart. And Breyer made sure that she got medical attention and saved her life and saved the life of Perdita. And every year on Perdita's birthday, Breyer would write, H.D. would write Breyer a letter of appreciation for saving her life. And how long their actual romantic sexual relationship lasted, nobody knows, but they were partners, they were really partners forever. Quite an enduring thing, even though they often did not live together. They would live together for periods of time in different apartments, on different continents, across the world. Breyer was always there in the background, even though initially she seemed to be the more infantile one. Over time, she was really the one that was taking care of H.D. How out were they? Not terribly out. They were so not out that when Breyer needed a husband in order to be able to manage any of her property, because this was England in the pre-feminist age, so she married twice. And somebody once accused H.D. of ruining Breyer's marriage to this American who was a poet. So they weren't terribly out, but their circle knew what was going on. So it was an interesting life altogether. Okay. They were completely polyamorous. Okay. They both had other lovers throughout their relationship. And they were deeply, of course they didn't use that term, that's a new term, but they were deeply polyamorous. And to give you an example of this, at one point H.D. started a relationship with a man named Kevin McPherson. Now she was introduced to this, Kenneth McPherson. She was introduced to him by Frances Gregg, her first lover. And Frances said to her about Kenneth, Kenneth was the original slug who poked his head above the slime. She was referring to his family. I wanted the original woman who poked her head through the womb of time. You are it, and I am your stillborn child. Stillborn twin, sorry. So she first was involved with Kenneth, then Kenneth moved on to H.D. It was apparently H.D.'s one of her favorite romantic relationships. And she said she would gladly live those years over with him. And what was the resolution of it? Kenneth married Breyer. Okay? And the three of them lived in a ménage à trois, totally non-sexual after a certain point, for quite a few years in the period leading up to and during the time that H.D. was in analysis with Freud. Another couple of things of the aspects of her life before the analysis took place. Any questions, by the way? Everything moving along okay? Okay. Anyway, H.D. in spite of Breyer's eventually stabilizing influence, she had a very hard time after the war. So she went to Havelock Ellis, the psychiatrist and the sexologist. And boundaries were kind of loose at that time. So H.D. went to him for help, and some of the help apparently involved urinating on him, which was his favorite sexual fantasy. And he wrote a rather magnificent description of being urinated on by her. And she was deeply appreciative of his help. She felt that he brought something alive in her that had been really dead afterward. And while she had complaints about him, that she complained about him with Freud, he actually traveled with her and with Breyer to Greece together. So again, we're looking at a world before analytic boundaries were set, before professional boundaries were set, and which experiences which were both helpful and hurtful were available to people in a way that they certainly are not available today. Fortunately, but nevertheless, something appears to have been lost as well. Now, when she went to Greece, she had a couple of episodes throughout her life of some kind of dissociative experiences and or psychotic experiences. So there was one experience that she had while she was in England that she called her jellyfish experience. By the way, I don't have any, my watch stopped, so I have no idea. Where are we at time? Okay. Okay. Oh, so I got to get going. Okay. Okay. Anyway. So what? Okay. So she had experiences, one of seeing visions on the wall in Greece that she and Freud spent a lot of time on, and another one that she called the jellyfish experience, where she felt like she was enclosed in a bell jar. And later she would have experiences of actual frank psychosis. So she didn't seem to object to these, but she would go in and out of them. So let's start moving forward to the analysis. Why did she go? You okay? Sorry about that. She said her reasons for going forward she wanted to free herself of repetitive thoughts and experiences, and to help her with her experiences that happened after the First World War, and to help her with her war shock. She said, my session with the professor was barely underway before there were preliminary signs and symbols of the approaching ordeal. And I think primarily wanted to get into the open the war, its cause and effect, and its inevitable effect on my neurotic breakdown. And all of that was driven deeper during the analysis with Freud, because this was taking place in 1933. The Nazis were on the rise. There was all kinds of tension in Vienna at this point. It was originally social democratic / communist. Then the local Nazis were on the rise, and then there was a local fascist movement, and there was often fighting in the streets. So this was going on throughout the period of her analysis. Okay. So let's go right to her first session. Okay? She walks in, she looks around, and she is absolutely enthralled by all of his artifacts, Greek and Egyptian artifacts. I don't know if any of you have ever seen, I'm sure you've all seen pictures of his office. I went to his office in London last year, and I was shocked. He has hundreds of objects. This is a museum. This is not just a little collection of beautiful things. Hundreds and hundreds of objects from China, from India, from Greece. Some of them were Cretan. So she came in, and she is a Greekophile. Okay, she translates Greek. She speaks Greek. She looks in, and my fantasy is she just looked at this and she said, "Oh my God, I didn't expect this. Nobody told me you had all of these things." Freud looks at her and says, "You're the first person who ever walked in here and looked at my office instead of looking at me," and interpreted it as if she wasn't interested in him. And he said to her, Well, first he tells her, don't touch the dog. Okay? So she kneels down and calls the dog over and makes friends with the dog. Okay? She's not going to listen to this. She described the dog looking like a young lion. And Freud says to her at some point during the session, I see you are going to be very difficult. Now, although it is against the rules, I will tell you something. In caps, she writes, you were disappointed and you are disappointed in me. And then she said, I then let out a howl and screamed, but do you not realize you are everything? You are a priest, you are a magician. And he said, no, it is you who are a poet and magician. I then cried so I could hardly utter. And he said, that I preferred looking at pictures, preferring the mere dead shreds of antiquity to his living presence. And I then yelled, but you, see, your dog liked me. When your dog came, I knew it was all right. It would not have liked me if I had not liked you. And he said an English proverb, but reversed, like me, like my dog. And I corrected, love me, love my dog. There is a theme throughout this of Freud wanting to be loved by her. Nevertheless, the crying seemed to stop after the first session. Let's see. He said, he gave me a long speech about how sad it was for a poet to have to listen to his bad English. And he said, we seem to meet in our love of antiquity. Okay? In the next session, she said, Papa, she referred to him always as Papa or Papalito or a little owl, a little ibu, okay? Papa says I have a delicate voice and I have to pitch it rather strong, as he says. At 77, one does not always hear everything. I was terribly, terribly happy, but more calm. Now I do not cry. It is very, very right for me here. So, one thing they used to do together is they would walk around his office and he would show her all of his statues. And he would handle them and she would handle them. And this was reminiscent of her playing with toys with her father when she was young. And one of the things that he brought to her was, she says, I had the most charming hour. I was solemnly taken to the inner room, which was filled with glass cases of the most lovely Greek bronzes. Anyhow, I talked and talked. He showed her a little bronze of Athena, helmeted, clothed head to foot in a carved robe. One hand was extended as if holding a staff or a rod. This is my favorite, he said. She is perfect, only she has lost her spear. Okay? So she wonders throughout, and I wonder throughout, how much of what Freud was doing was interpretation, and he made lots and lots of interpretations, and how much were these symbolic communications. But it was very interesting that his first communication, which some people have argued was a communication of his theory of penis envy, was in fact telling her basically, you know, a woman can be perfect, only she has lost something. And she came in partly because she felt like she had lost the ability to write. How are we doing on time?
Let's see.
Okay, moving along. Okay. Let's see. Now, at some point in the analysis, we're not entirely clear when, I'm certainly not clear when, he says, I do not know what enraged him suddenly. For myself, I veer around, uncanonically, seated stark upright with my feet on the floor. The professor is uncanonical himself. He is beating with his hand on his fist on the headpiece of the old-fashioned horsehair sofa that has heard more secrets than the confession box of any popular Roman Catholic confessor. Even as I veered around facing him, my mind was detached enough to wonder if this was some idea of his for speeding up the analytic content or redirecting the flow of associated images. The professor said, the trouble is, I am an old man. You do not think it is worth your while to love me. Now, this is what she reports. One person said there's no evidence that this happened, but there's no evidence that any of this happened, because everything that we know about this analysis comes from books that she wrote about this and letters that she wrote to Breyer. I don't see any reason to disbelieve this, and a letter that he writes later on would seem to confirm it. But there seemed to be some tension between her, with her wanting to be loved and him wanting to be loved by her. And that seemed to be an undercurrent of this analysis while they were discussing all kinds of other stuff that was much more traditionally analytic. So soon he decided, and I'm just going to go back and forth. All of the evidence is very confusing here, so if you can't make sense of the flow of it from me, it's because I couldn't make sense of it either. He says he decided, yes, please.
How much was what was happening with the Nazis in pre-war era affecting them psychologically?
Terribly, terribly. There's one point where basically the city is in civil war. None of his patients showed up except her. And she showed up, and he said, "Why did you come?" And she said to herself, "To show you that I loved you." She was terrified because there was one day that there were swastikas all over the city, paper swastikas being thrown all over the city. Another day she came to the house, and it was swastikas were chalked. And in between all of the analysis, he was talking about the Nazis, she was talking about the Nazis, she was terrified that he would die. He was pretty much in denial about the whole thing. He thought Hitler was a monster, but the Austrians would persuade them. And she was just terrified all through this thing. Okay. And then he would say something like, "Let's get back to your analysis," because that, of course, is the most important thing. So he said, getting back to the analysis, that her transference was a mother fixation. She was back to the earliest level of mother fixation before there was any difference between the sexes. So she wasn't recognized as a girl yet, and he wasn't or as a boy, and he called it the phallic mother, and that she was very, very connected on this level. And she absolutely loved this idea. Okay? And one other thing, she had already had a very combined sexual identity. She was very attached to a statue of Hermaphrodite earlier on. And so when she came in to Freud, she was discussing all of these sorts of things. Okay. So he said, the trouble is, I do not like to be the mother in the transference. It always surprises and shocks me a little. I feel so very masculine. I asked him if others had had this mother transference to him, and he said, a little wistfully, "Oh, very many." So on the one hand, they're both having this intense transference-countertransference relationship. On the other hand, they're talking about it as cooperative adults, friends. He lent her books. He offered things to her. He intervened in terms of changing appointments with other patients with her. When she would forget something, he would bring books to her. He would remind her of stuff. So there was this very, just this whole sort of double layer going on here. Okay. About 10 weeks into the analysis, he explains the theory of penis envy to her. She doesn't seem to object at all. She says it seems to explain a lot of things, is what she wrote to Breyer. Okay. I'll tell you, but she did say to him, the supreme compliment to woman would be to trust women with this great secret of penis envy and not to keep it a secret. This whole thing is a little bit hard to understand because the theory had been out in the open. She had been reading his papers for years, and it was as if he was telling her a secret and she had never heard it before. I don't know what to make of it. I don't know what to make of a lot of this stuff. I'm going to read you one dream that she had, okay, late at one point in the analysis, another couple of snippets, and then we're going to move on to the poem, okay? This was a dream that she had toward the end of the first part of the analysis, which lasted, by the way, 6 days a week for just 3 months. So a lot by those standards, but nevertheless pretty short by our standards. Okay, she was talking about
being. It was 2 separate times.
There were 2 separate times, and there was another 6 weeks, a year and a half later. Okay, this is at the end of the first part. She was angry with one of her friends for being involved with making a fool out of herself with a man. And what happened was that she wrote to Breyer and she said, "You and I and someone named Joan, we're in a car or a carriage. We got to the country. I looked up. there was a giant moon bigger than the sun. It was rainbow colored and like a pool of rainbow in the sky, enormous. As I looked, there was a dim figure of a woman in the moon. She was clothed with sante, mystic, wonderful, draped in flowing rainbow-colored robes, seated like Madonna in a curved frame. But she was not Madonna in that sense. She was Greek. She was Artemis, and she was pregnant. A perfect Renaissance idea. Virgin but pregnant. Moon of my delight that knows no wane. I shouted to you, and Joan took a look. A bird crossed the surface, a dark pigeon, a dove. Freud tells me it is an almost perfect mythological state I was in. The moon, of course, equated mother, but it was mother in heaven. You and Joan and I were a sort of band of sisters, the graces of the fates. I was taking a step forward into the pure homo layer, not lesbian exactly, but just that, the three sisters. Sisters with a mother in heaven. I slept for 2 hours like the dead afterward, and now I am different all over, as if I had changed an electric current in myself. The band of sisters, of course, cannot contemplate the father as fertilizing element in the state of pure homosexuality, neat as a pin. Okay. And then later, in the second part, he said to her, your problem is that you had to hide as a boy and hide as a girl. And she said, and I realize in my writing I find that I have to commit myself to being male or female. But he says this will all get sorted out. And in their last session, because we're moving along, the professor one winter day offered me a little branch. It had come in a box of oranges. He said, I thought I might like this. I took the branch, a tiny tree in itself. It's a cluster of golden fruit. It was an orange branch with fruit on it. I did not say what I could not formulate in words. I could not have trusted myself with the words. They were there. They were singing, all terribly symbolic. Okay. She wrote to him later, several years later, and he wrote back and he said, I had imagined I had become insensitive to praise and blame. Reading your kind lines and getting aware of how I enjoyed them, I first thought I had been mistaken about my firmness. On second thoughts, I concluded I was not. What you gave me was not praise, but affection, and I need not be ashamed of my satisfaction. Life at my age is not easy, but spring is beautiful, and so is love. Amazing, isn't it? Let's go to the poem. I'll talk about some of her afterlife and the effects of the analysis, positive or negative, later. But I think we have the background to the poem at this point. Okay?
Whew. Everybody want to take a deep breath?
Yeah.
That was wonderful,
Oh,
and I have to say,
Hello.
yeah, thank you so much. It filled in a lot. We both have been communicating, but not really.
A little closer.
But not really, in a deep analytic way. We both sort of wanted to just sort of wing it. And so I appreciate this. I only have one question. When is James Ivory going to do a movie of this?
Oh, yeah.
That's what I want to know. I'm going to say a few things, and I'm going to get into the poem. I'm going to sort of shift gears for all of you guys as far as poetry and how to hear her voice. I'm not going to presume to tell you how to hear her voice. What I have here is poet envy versus penis envy. Freud did really love poets. There's a famous line where he said, wherever I go, a poet is there before me. And so certainly that informed his relationship with H.D. And I believe that poetry analysis are very linked in their use and love of paradox and of everything converging together in words in one place. They're both events. Now, I think I'm going to do, I have some lovely quotes for anybody who wants to know, but I want you to think of poems and sessions, because they are, as complete events about things and events in and of themselves. And just to get things started, before I read the master, I wanted to just read two brief poems just to give you, to sort of switch your brains to the more of the musicality and the sound of poems, and with which to also contrast her poem. So I'm going to read two poems which are two of my favorite. One is by Rilke in 1900, and the other one is by Lucille Clifton. Do people know Lucille Clifton? She's a wonderful African-American woman who lived from 1953 to 2010. So I'm going to read these, and it's sort of like a palate cleanser, an opening act for the master. The first one by Rilke is Widening Circle, and it goes as follows. I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. I may not complete this last one, but I give myself to it. I circle around God, around the primordial tower. I've been circling for thousands of years, and I still don't know. Am I a falcon, a storm, or a great song? So that's Rilke. Lucille Clifton, this is one of the best poems by her, which is I am accused of tending to the past. And there's a method to my madness, so bear with me. I am accused of tending to the past as if I made it, as if I sculpted it with my own hands. I did not. This past was waiting for me when I came, a monstrous unnamed baby, and I, with my mother's itch, took it to breast and named it history. She is more human now, learning languages every day, remembering faces, names, and dates. When she is strong enough to travel on her own, beware, she will. So you guys already, what I want to say about poetry is that, and what Ogden who loved poetry, Thomas Ogden, one of my favorite analysts, is that it's, again, the event, and to try to get behind the words and to try to get into the rhythm. And one of the things that H.D. was into was rhythm. Her poem is rather long, and I've cut it, selected and cut it. I can talk afterward about the school. She was from a definite school, the Imagiste. I don't know how to pronounce that school. But what I want, you all have her poem, right? Yeah. So what I want to sort of do is say, first, when you're about to read a poem like this, you want to look at the title, and you want to look at what the poem looks like to you. Look at the visual, because poems are not only about reading poems, but they're about what the poem looks like, what the title announces. Now, we didn't call this presentation The Master, because if we had, maybe we'd get a different audience, I don't know. We called it Woman Isn't Perfect because it is so striking. And again, I'm so informed by what you just presented. And the master. And a question to ask is, well, how does that set us up from the beginning with the master? Who is the master? And that's a question which may seem obvious, but I'm going to leave hanging in the air. So now, unless anybody has any questions, comments, queries, observations, feedback, I'm going to start. I'm going to find it first. And again, you can read along, or I might suggest you just listen to how she creates the music of it, and based on what Paul has presented. It's in several parts, as you can see, and very sort of long columns. I almost think of her Greek columns. The master. He was very beautiful, the old man, and I knew wisdom. I found measureless truth in his words. His command was final. How did he understand? When I traveled, and I want to just stop here, Miletus is a Greek town, and it holds the oracle of Apollo. So that's one word you should know. A lot of times, especially when people like H.D. use Greek words and stuff, and for those of you who are put off by poetry or intimidated, don't be. I had to read this many, 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 many times, and I write poetry. There's also a word hieratic later, which is sacrificial, priestly. We know what hieratic means, right? So I will continue. How did he understand? When I traveled to Miletus to get wisdom, I left all else behind. I fasted, I worked late, rose early. Whether I wore simple garments or intricate, nothing was lost. Each vestment had meaning. Every gesture is wisdom, he taught. Nothing is lost, he said. I went late to bed or early. I caught the dream and rose dreaming, and we wrought philosophy on the dream content. I was content. Nothing was lost, for God is all and the dream is God. Only to us is small wisdom, but great enough to know God everywhere. Oh, he was fair. Even when I flung his words in his teeth, he said, I will soon be dead. I must learn from the young. His charity was absolute, for I had to love him then. I had to recognize that he was beyond all men, nearer to God. He was so old. I had to claim pardon, which he granted with his old head. So wise, so beautiful, and his mouth so young, and his eyes. Oh God, let there be some surprise in heaven for him. For no one but you could devise anything suitable for him. So beautiful. So I'm going to skip the next stanza, and I'm actually going to go to the third stanza. What can God give the old man who made this possible? For a woman breathes fire and is cold. A woman sheds snow from ankles and is warm. White heat melts into snowflake, and violets turn to pure amethyst, water clear. No, I did not falter. I saw the whole miracle. I knew that the old man made this tenable, but how else could he have foreseen the impossible? How could he have known how each gesture of this dancer would be hieratic? Words were scrawled on papyrus. Words were written most carefully. Each word was separate, yet each word led to another word. And the whole made a rhythm in the air, till now unguessed at, unknown. I was angry at the old man. I wanted an answer, a neat answer. When I argued and said, well, tell me, you will soon be dead. The secret lies with you, he said. You are a poet. I do not wish to be treated like a child, a weakling, so I said I was angry. You cannot last forever. The fire of wisdom dies with you. I have traveled far to Miletus. You cannot stay long now with us. I came for an answer. I was angry with the old man, with his talk of the man's strength. I was angry with his mysteries. I argued till daybreak. Oh, it was late, and God will forgive me my anger, but I could not accept it. I could not accept from wisdom what love taught. Woman is perfect. She is a woman, yet beyond woman, yet in woman. Her feet are the delicate pulse of the narcissus bud pushing from earth. Ah, where is your man strength? Her arms are the waving of the young male, tentative, reaching out that first evening alone in a forest. She is woman. Her thighs are frail yet strong. She leaps from rock to rock. It was only a small circle for her dance. And the hills dance. She conjures the hills. Rhododendrons awake. Her feet pulse. The rhododendrons wake. There is purple flower between her marble, her birch tree white thighs. Or there is a red flower. There is a rose flower parted wide as her limbs fling wide in dance, ecstatic Aphrodite. There is a frail lavender flower hidden in grass. Oh God, what is it, this flower, that in itself had power over the whole earth? For she needs no man. Herself is that dart and pulse of the male, hands, feet, thighs, herself perfect. Now I'm going to go to the seventh stanza. And I'm happy, especially for people who've read and studied the poem, to go back and read whatever you want me to read. He will trouble the thoughts of men. Yet for many an eon, they will travel far and wide. They will discuss all his written words. His pen will be sacred. They will build a temple and keep all his sacred writings safe. And men will come and men will quarrel, but he will be safe. They will found temples in his name. His fame will be so great that anyone who has known him will also be hailed as master, seer, interpreter. Only I will escape. And it was he himself, he who set me free to prophesy. He did not say, "Stay, my disciple." He did not say, "Write, each word I say is sacred." He did not say, "Teach." He did not say, "Heal or seal documents in my name." No. He was rather casual. "We won't argue about that," he said. "You are a poet." So I went forth, blinded with the sort of terrible tears that won't fall. I said goodbye and saw his old head as he turned, as he left the room, leaving me alone with all his trophies, the marbles, the vases, the stone sphinx, the old jars from Egypt. He left me alone with these things, and his old back was bowed. Oh God, those tears didn't come. How could they? I went away. I said, "I won't have this tyranny of an old man. He is too old. I will die if I love him. I cannot love him. He is too near, too precious to God." But one does not forget him who makes all things feasible. One who does not forgive him who makes God and all possible, for that is unbearable. Now I can bear even God, for a woman's laughter prophesies happiness. Not not men. Only one, the old man, sacred to God. No man will be present in those mysteries, yet all men will kneel. No man will be potent, important, yet all men will feel what it is to be a woman, will yearn, burn, turn from easy pleasure to hardship of the spirit. Men will see how long they have been blind. Poor men, poor mankind. How long this thought of the man pulse has tricked them, has weakened them, shall see woman, perfect. And they did. I was not the only one that cried madly, madly. We were together. We were one. We were together. We were one. Sun worshippers. We flung as one voice our cry, Rhodocleia, Rhodocleia near to the sun. We did not say, pity us. We did not say, look at us. We cried, O heart of the sun, rhododendron, Rhodocleia, we are unworthy your beauty. You are near beauty, the sun. You are that Lord become woman.
Wow.
Oh.
Beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. So, everybody. It's an interesting, what I would say to you all is I have some questions for you. Having heard this, I don't know, first, does anybody want to just have comments or questions for Paul or myself?
I just want to say that there is on YouTube some audio of her reading her own poetry.
Oh my goodness.
Sounding old beyond the 75 years that she lived. This shows what's happened to us. We're much more vital now. That the reading is, I would say, so dramatic, but the stuff is histrionic. She's really inside. It's so expressive and strong.
Ah, I wish I had.
Just do a YouTube search on.
Oh, I would love
see
that.
it.
I would love that. Well, if we take this on the road, I'll definitely study it. I have the height. I don't have the willowiness yet. So, here's the thing. could maybe all of you, some of you, one of you explain to Paul and me what it means? Woman is perfect. What's going on here? How do you, as you hear the poem and you know about her life, think woman is perfect?
Like an antique statue.
Like
the antique statue.
Like the antique statue.
Like the Greek goddess. Freud was a very obsessive collector of antiquity. I once saw the show, enormous. In the Rodin Museum in Paris, it's an enormous museum all full of Freud's collection. He was obsessed with collecting, not only with collection, he was running everywhere, having dealers everywhere, and in Europe, and buying and buying.
And which brings me to mind, of course, as a therapist, the search for love, which you were saying, the search for love in terms of things, in terms of lovers. Freud, I would say, and a colleague told me this who studied Freud, was rather decrepit by this time. He was ill, he didn't smell good, and that's why what's so interesting in this poem is that she starts by saying, he was very beautiful, the old man. And she goes on about his age. And I thought one of the things of this particular poetry school, and of HD especially, was that she loved nature. And if you love nature, you've been in nature, you know that some of the old things, the fungus, the things that are rotting, the driftwood, is quite beautiful. And I feel like she almost, in some ways, objectified him. And when she talks about him being beautiful, we usually, at least now in the society, don't put together old and beautiful. But this is the beauty of the poetry, which is that it creates this kind of, to me, paradox. The master, it's the master, and yet, if you read some about this poem, well, there are so many different levels. You said the analysis takes place on more than one level. There's a word, palimpsest. Palimpsest. Okay. What does that word mean, please?
A word that means the same thing going forward and backwards.
Oh no! That's palindrome. No, palimpsest.
Many layers.
And when we talk about palimpsest, whether again, and what I want you to really appreciate is just how much the work that we do is I think it excites the same neurons and stuff as the poets. Palimpsest can be thought of also like tracing paper with layer on layer on layer to create the whole picture. Mm-hmm. And so she's looking at Freud as the master. But who else is the master here in this poem? She is. Yeah, mm-hmm. She's the master. This is, she is the master. He is the master. I could argue the poem is the master. The poem, in the sense that it mastered a complex experience. So when we say woman is perfect, yes, it's almost, especially with Me Too and everything. This can't be read. What I like about this is its complexity, and it's feminist. She has a place among feminists, even for that. The way her lines are, the way the sound of the poem is, which I'll go into. I want more of your reactions first. But it's also what Paul was, so many parts of this woman, the male, the female, everything converging in what she's trying to express in the poem.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering what your reaction was in hearing this.
It all came together. It came together so richly for me. I mean, when I read it, that's what excited me to do the presentation in the first place. The sense of empowerment that she had, but also the complexity of how she both wanted him and admired him and fought with him and integrated him and moved beyond him and was very, very equal with him. reminds me of something that I didn't mention before, which is that she had a fantasy of being a tiger and having a tiger within her that she mentioned to him. And she was afraid of what would happen if the tiger came out. And he said, "Don't worry, I have a lion to protect me." Is Chow. So he was reassuring her, but she felt this inner power. And I felt very much the inner power when you were talking and when you were reading the poem. It was really bringing out a layer that I had seen but hadn't felt. One other thing just to note about the Pamela.
Swing in and out.
I don't know why not.
No, try yours.
I'll try mine.
And I think you gotta turn the volume down.
How's-
Hello. Oh, wait. Isn't it interesting that we both have these nice wands? Yes? Okay, I can project.
Just keep the mic further away.
Okay.
It's better with the mic.
Well, we'll do a compromise. We'll keep the mic further away and we'll project.
Okay.
It's clipping, you know, mic.
Okay,
All
yeah.
right.
But if you keep it further away, it might work.
Oh,
Here, have one.
how's this? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. That word that I can't pronounce either,
Palimpsest.
Palimpsest. Both of them. She wrote a book called of that name. I'm not even going to try to say it again.
It means when writing has been erased to make room for new.
Yeah, and Freud wrote a paper called The Magic Tablet, in which there's a little wax paper on top of the wax tablet. You write, and then you erase the writing underneath. We all had this. Many of us had this as a child.
Yeah,
And
careers.
it still leaves a tracing underneath. So they both came up with this independently. They both had that same kind of multi-layered thought. He told her at one point in the analysis, with a patient like you, there is never a single explanation of anything. One more thing, and then we want to go on, just in terms of where Freud was at this point in time. He didn't love seeing patients at this point. He told another patient, I don't know what the countertransference communication was, patients are a rabble. They are good for extending my research and extending my fame, but not for much anything else. And he was saying that he would only take patients who brought him something, who had something to teach him.
But
And
wasn't he diagnosed with cancer?
he was already deep into the cancer at this point. You know, he was still 6 years away from death, but he was miserable. Anyway, back to the.
Yeah. And something else to consider is her working through all of her losses and the death, I think it was of her favorite brother and her father. And here she's in therapy with a man who is disintegrating, really. What my colleague told me was that Freud actually smelled bad because he was deteriorating. And yet, I think, and maybe this was also a factor in her love for him, or when we talk about compassion, and she definitely felt his compassion. I just want to ask, what do people make of the use of by internal rhyme? What we mean is that something rhymes, but it isn't at the end of each line. It's within. As I was reading it, what sense? What we talk about emotional communication, right? And what I read the first two poems because I think they gave a very different feeling than this poem. What feeling did you get? And I granted my reading influences that, but what feeling did you get from the way everything was rhyming internally? Do people know what internal rhyme is? Yeah, right? This is one of my favorite internal rhymes here is, "Oh God, let there be some surprise in heaven for him, for no one but you could devise anything suitable for him. So beautiful." And actually, those are end rhymes. So, yeah. Marie.
But when you said that look at that visually,
Yes, look at the.
when I read it first time, I thought that it's actually not necessary to have such a short line. Sometimes it's 2 words, 3 words.
Yes.
It's the internal speaking. It has internal rhymes, but it does sort of like a protracting, prolonging a session. It's like almost like she's in a session with me.
Oh, because it's word by word by word
Yes, and
by
she
word.
sort of wants to make it longer and not to separate from him. Because of the losses, maybe he is a father figure who knows.
Yes.
Papa, he's Papa, right?
Yes, he's Papa.
Right.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So, but and just to repeat what you said, for is that it's in this column, and as you're reading it, and I would say for anybody with interest in poetry, please read the poem out loud, because it'll open you up to the poem even more. But each of these lines and the rhymes, it both contains, I find internal rhymes sort of contains the thought. She sort of takes it and puts it out and takes it back, and puts it out and takes it back. And what you said, of word to word to word, if it was longer, it's like when I read the Rilke poem. The translation was very long lines. And so it's almost puts you in a very much more thoughtful mind. This is almost a fevered thing going along, But at the same time, she chose to put it in a column instead of, if you see some poems, they're all over the place. So she has a steady column, but yeah, each word is emphasized, almost like she wants to be heard, like in the session. I want to say one thing, and then I'll call on you. One thing which I recall, there was a male therapist that I knew who died, and I was at a memorial at which his patients were passing around. And this reminds me of Freud. A female patient said, I always thought this therapist, I always thought he was fighting with me, but now I realize he was fighting for me. And that's how I feel what Freud was doing. Yes, back there, please. Please.
I'm not a poet, but I write some songs, and I see here some areas where you're playing with words, kind of rhyme, kind of meaning. I caught the dream, I rose dreaming.
Yes.
Kind of like getting out of the dream, you're using a verb, you're using, I guess, a noun. And we wrote about the dream content.
Yes.
And I was content.
And I was content,
So kind
right.
of playing with words.
Oh, I didn't hear that one before. That's gorgeous.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So how does that affect you as the listener and the reader?
Oh, I got to think about that, but I think I still go back to what I said before. Maybe I worked one time where there was a trauma where I worked, and I worked with kids. I mean, they were in wartime, and I'm thinking he's dying there in wartime. And if you think everything's a dream where you're content and everything's perfect, everything's imperfect all around you. So it could be a defense, or I'm not going to take it beyond that, but just from my own experience.
Yeah. I mean, I think what Paul said, they were both trying to not be traumatized, but they were, and maybe for both of them, this was such a refuge. And I know, lately more has been written about love between the therapist and the patient. Just more the higher kind of love, and that they really, and I know that for all of us, there are certain people who see us in analysis or therapy that we just speak to us. It's like certain poems. I like certain poems better. I like, and for the two of them, maybe it was also, I think what you're saying, the time that they met was so fraught, and her life had been so fraught. Sometimes in trauma, it's almost like a repetition was so fraught.
I was just thinking my own experience. I worked at a school where some people died, and I couldn't really be the same with the kids I worked with, but I did keep my distance. But you get more energized too, or you identify with you working with the
Yes.
Yeah, I was thinking that she loved his age. I think she loved that he was old, because she said she knew wisdom's age. She was
Yes.
looking, she was searching. I mean, her life sounds so confusing with all these relationships.
Yes.
And it seemed like she was searching for some kind of, like she says, answer. And she thought his age and his wisdom.
Going along with what you said, something else that happened in the first session was that she was apparently distressed that she was taller than he was. So he made her go over and stand next to him and say that, well, you're not that much taller, because apparently she wanted to feel younger with him. She really came with the idea that she wanted to be younger. You know?
Well, and there's also the feeling, a theme in here, of wisdom and love. And, you know, I could not accept from wisdom what love taught. And then she hits you with, woman is perfect. And I actually want to get back to that question. What does it mean, really?
Can I just say something about wisdom and love?
Yeah.
And she knew this. I didn't hear this before you just said it. Okay. The Athena, the goddess that he showed her that was perfect, her one of her animals was the owl, and it was the owl of wisdom. Okay. So she called him an owl, and her father had a stuffed owl in his office. So when she says she couldn't accept from wisdom what love taught, the whole image of Athena being perfect was definitely layered in there. You know, there's no question in my mind that every word that she picked was multi-layered.
Absolutely,
you know?
yeah. I mean, she was a master of that school. The whole idea was to not have lots of adjectives, to be direct, to use nature and mythology coming together, the natural world and the mythical world. And Athena, by the way, interestingly enough, as you know, in Greek literature, sprang from the head of Zeus, from the head of her papa, right? That's how she was born. And Freud did like a female, you know, he was saddened to be a mother and not a father in the transfers sometimes. Mm-hmm. But I think,
And he there's only one other woman that people associate his relationship with HD with, and that was Lou André Salome. Now, Lou André Salome was a German intellectual who had been involved with Nietzsche.
Russian.
What?
Russian.
Russian. Oh, excuse me, Russian. Yeah, but she lived mostly in Germany. No, thank you. No, thank you for clarifying that. But she was close to Nietzsche. She was a lover of Rilke, who wrote that poem. She became an analyst. After Freud attempted his ridiculous analysis of his daughter Anna, he sent her to Lou Salome, and she herself was an extremely formidable woman, extremely intelligent, and he had the same type of very respectful closeness with her that he had with HD. It wasn't the same kind of love, perhaps, but the two of them were involved for years and years, and he spoke of her with utmost respect all throughout. So this was really, and when you think of the Athena image, Athena was also the goddess of war. So that's also within this whole thing, and the whole war trauma and fortifying herself. That was in a piece that I didn't get to, fortifying herself for the coming war, because she wanted to be able to help people deal with the war that she knew was coming.
And this is when she's talking about being both, I think, male and female, the man's strength, you know. I wanted to say, in line with the columns, I'm just going back to the visuals, and also one thing you see in the poem is a struggle between this kind of headlong word to word thing and the fact that there's an almost urgent thing for, and it reminds me of when you're in session with somebody where they have an urgent spurt of thoughts, and then there's a stanza, and they sort of have listened to themselves, and then they continue on into the next one. The poem begins with, he was very beautiful, with really moving, you know, from being content to, you know, I have found my man, I have found my God, I have found my master in the first stanza, and moving, you know, more, I think, in the second stanza, which I didn't read. But there's sort of, because HD had, I think, in her own life, boundaries were a real issue. There were none. Sometimes with polyamory, it's another paradox, because you have to have great boundaries and you have to have very loose boundaries, and you have to have both at the same time. And I think that with her, that's expressed in this poem as well.
Yeah, she really softens him with her love for him. And I was really struck by their ability to play. They played so well together.
Yes.
They brought out each other's creativity.
Yeah, I think that she did. Like I said, he had sort of poet envy.
Yes.
And I think it was wonderful for her to have a therapist. There are therapists who can be very damaging to artists because they want to sort of analyze the art out of the artist. And to understand what he understood about her, which I love, is that she had her own way of looking at it. And you could say, well, maybe he just thought she was a histrionic, delusional, occasionally psychotic woman, so he wasn't going to argue with her. Or we have the thing of you can't, everything Freud said, you can't analyze narcissists or this or that. But you don't get that sense with the kind of companionship that they have.
No, I want to. I'm sorry. There was somebody.
Yeah. We'll get back.
Yeah, we'll get back.
That's part of what I really like is the gender fluidity, sexuality fluidity in the poem, which quite a bit to me was connected to your original question, which was about the internal rhyming. That goes together in my mind.
Yes.
Another thing about Athena was birthed through the head of Zeus, but Zeus swallowed Metis, her mother.
Oh.
And that's how he was impregnated with her. So that whole
Wow, I didn't know that.
People
Yeah,
hear that?
fertilized.
We're talking about.
it was the female.
It was the reversal.
It was
Yeah.
the reversal. He took her in.
Oh, okay. Do you know, we should probably even pass this around.
Yeah. Could you say that again?
Yes,
Sorry,
please.
because that's really important.
Yeah, Athena was birthed through her father's head, but how the story is really that Metis was Athena's mother, and Zeus was afraid that she was going to give birth to a son who might overtake him, as he did with his father. So he turned her into a fly, turned Metis into a fly, and swallowed her. And that was the gestation. So I think when we're talking about this gender, sexuality, fluidity, it's just kind of interesting. I would say originally within Greece, the patriarchal ideal was prevalent.
It was prevalent, but certainly that the image of Athena holding the spear and being the goddess of war is one of the strangest images that I'm aware of. That whole combination of gender fluidity. So, let's see. We're
at the 8 o'clock mark.
We're at the 8 o'clock mark, so
8 o'clock
we
mark.
still have more time.
We have more time.
Let's see. At some point, I wanted to talk a little. I know there was another comment from over there.
Oh, you were asking about the age, how old
No,
she
I was
was?
just wondering how old she was when she was in treatment.
She was 44, huh? 46.
And how long after the work together did she write this
Write
poem?
this poem after, I think in the early 40s. It was a couple years
She
after.
died?
Now, here's
She
what's
didn't publish.
interesting, and I wonder if anybody has any speculation. She did not want this poem published till after her death. And
Her death?
after her death.
She wrote it after his death.
Yes, but she did not want this poem to come to light, which I find interesting because she wrote a tribute to Freud. She wrote many books about it, and so one wonders if this is a very intimate. Yeah.
One of the few times she got angry at Breyer. She apparently didn't get angry very often, but one of the few times was when Breyer wanted to publish this poem. And I just wanted to say a little bit about her life. Well, two more things that I didn't get a chance to before. We're talking about the harmonious elements in their relationship, but there was conflict. At one point, she was telling him about her love of Frances Gregg, and she said she thought she could be happy with her. And Freud kind of sounded rather flippant and said, well, biologically, no. And her next association is to her windows in her London flat being bombed out in an air raid during World War I. So that was her reaction to that. Maybe a more direct reaction, a less victimized reaction, was that he didn't argue with her so much about the astrology, but apparently after a certain point, whenever she would mention it, he would snort. So she'd mention something about the astrology, and he'd go, or something along those lines.
But there was more, it seemed that when she said she flung things back in his teeth or whatever, the arguments between them seemed to have been, she considered herself a prophet, and he kept saying, no, you're a poet. That wasn't necessarily as complimentary as it was sounding right here, because he didn't believe in the religious aspect.
Well, he didn't believe in it, and she said, yes, and on that he's wrong. She was very, very clear that as far as she was concerned, psychoanalysis and astrology each needed the other to inform each other. And after the analysis, she got much more into the spirituality. She made it very clear she wasn't buying all of that stuff. And in terms of the effect of it, she felt that it was a marvelous experience. There's no question about that. Their ménage broke up to some extent soon after the analysis. The man basically got more and more interested in other men, and he eventually moved to New York. And she spent less time with Breyer. And she worked more. She was able to work more. She became much more disciplined in her work again. She was always very disciplined. But she basically said, Breyer, you can't push me so much. I really need, if you push me, I will die. You can't intrude on this. You have to give me more space. So there was more independence from Breyer. At the same time, there was more focus on spirituality. There was eventually a more florid psychotic break shortly after World War II. She handled the bombing in London quite well. She volunteered. She stayed in London when she could have gone to the countryside. But she got involved with some sort of spiritualists who sort of metaphorically thought that British airmen were still alive, and she became obsessed with the idea that there was a realm in which all of the dead British airmen were still living. And she ended up she needed a hospitalization in Switzerland, and she ended up having an analyst with her all the time, basically. Melanie Klein's daughter's husband spent many years with her, and she ended up living in a mental hospital, kind of a high-class mental hospital in Switzerland, writing, having therapy, and giving therapy to others. But Breyer was always there, taking care of the bills, coming and visiting her. They always remained close. They had daily contact almost throughout her whole life.
And the child?
The child, apparently, it's interesting, they did not raise the child much. She was mostly in nurseries, mostly in private schools. She clearly loved her, but she could barely tolerate having her around when she was little. It's painful to hear how little she could tolerate that. But they ended up being very close. She moved to New York, apparently had, at least as far as I can tell, a happy, healthy life. With children who were themselves poets and artists. And Breyer had adopted the child as well, more or less. They kind of shared everything. Yeah. Anything else?
So little is known about her mother, H.D.'s mother.
Well, no, there is some known about her. She was apparently a gifted painter. She went to Vienna on her honeymoon. And she did some elementary school teaching, but was very, very focused on taking care of the family. And there was some question of how much she gave up her own artistic ambitions to take care of the family. They were a well-to-do family. There were some servants.
Do you know, I have one question I want to call. Actually, I have a question, because I'm sort of, and this is something we're trying out. How was it for people? What was your experience hearing the poem read after Paul? You have, there's a great temptation as you listen to a poem like this to, well, you know, to maybe start analyzing her. But what was it like? How did the two parts come together for you? You know, how did one inform the other, I guess is what I'm saying. Yes.
I thought, for me, they very much built on one another in terms of the unconscious. And that psychoanalysis is the realm of the unconscious, and poetry, on a good day, is the realm of the unconscious, so that both worlds are the same. I would have wanted to actually have the dream written out as the poem was. I wanted to spend a little more time with that because it's the same realm.
Right.
And I found them, from what I remember, similar. I wondered about the transference actually being a transference of God rather than Papa or Mama, especially in the poem. That it's a God transference, which is an idealized transference. And it struck me that they live in the same realm with what they do. And when he invited her in to the inner sanctum to see even more tchotchkes, and to me I was like, that's play therapy, that's sand play. If there was sand in there, those things would have been in the sand. But he was taking her and doing the same kind of thing. It was beautiful.
I want to just really underline what you just said about the unconscious and what was happening. And I want to read this very juicy quote by James Tate, the poet, which goes right to what you're saying. And he's talking, I'll just read it. Because he wrote about writing poetry, he said, because it is a difficult business being intensely conscious of all the ways of the poem is working, and simultaneously hoping, nay, counting on breaking into the vaults of the unconscious where valuable documents and priceless jewels are stored. And yet that is what we do. When it is all working, we have a language, mobile, and a perpetual motion machine made of words whose business is finally the truth. Now, what's remarkable is that H.D. made a familiar, sort of similar analogy to unconscious materials. And she writes, Freud unlocks vaults and caves in his unearthing buried treasures. His findings can include priceless treasures, gems, and jewels, or junk. What Freud offered as treasure, this revelation that he seemed to value, I think to what she was saying was poor stuff, trash indeed, that a rag picker would never pass over into staying, her offerings. And so this is, the rag and bone shop of the poet, of the session. So what you're saying, it speaks right to that, yeah?
And that's a perfect description of what you're trying to do in analysis. Using your words to maybe not break into the vault of the unconscious. That feels a little violating to me, but at least resonate with the unconscious and open the unconscious. And have it all work as a single element.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I have many, I just want to read this one thing by Evelyn Schwalber. And when you read it, it's exploring, it's the same as poetry or a session. And she says, exploring the patient's inner reality, and we could say exploring a poem, we are offered an extraordinary opportunity, though it remains elusive. Extraordinary because when we find our way into the patient's inner world, this can evoke a sense of discovery and recognition, holding a remarkable mutative potential. So it's extraordinary, and it's elusive because there is a continuing pull towards our own assumptions and predilections away from the depth of the patient's experience. So that tension, which is both when we are reading a poem, what it's the truth it's speaking to us, and the tension of being in session, where we're trying to purely, which I think Freud did beautifully with H.D., to make room for her life, her person, without imposing upon her, which he then, in a way, thanked him with the stanza of, he didn't ask me to be his disciple. Mm-hmm. Yeah? Mm-hmm. So now questions. I know yeah? Yes, no?
No, I was just originally I was responding to Woman is Perfect, but I'll
ahead.
Um,
Oh, do the whole schmear.
Originally, I was going to respond to woman is perfect, but that seems to be like something that gets larger and larger as you all speak. I find myself feeling a little uncomfortable about any kind of actual analytic sort of reading of what she's doing because she contradicts everything. Here she is this consummate poet, and yet in a certain way, it's the words are not. The words are only like a first level of thing. I think she gives you one image and then she contradicts it. She subverts pretty much everything, including her love for Freud.
Absolutely.
And at the end, I would be very careful about a feminist reading of Woman is Perfect
Exactly.
from our perspective now. I think that the line here at the end, where she's talking about, and by the way, the shortness of the lines is an oracular style.
Yes, it
When I
is.
hear you reading it, it sounds rather conversational except for the internal rhymes, which feels like somebody wrapping their mouth around a word or words, trying to bite down on something. But actually, there's a conversational flow. And yet, when you look at it at the page, it looks like York with a donut. I mean, that's what they
Yeah.
Here she says, she repeats this, we were together, we were one. We were together, we were one. Woman is not perfect from our feminist perspective backwards. Woman is perfect as we are. Everything, it's hermaphroditic, essentially.
Yes.
Hermaphroditic.
Yes.
She chooses the word woman, but I think it's not. We can't read it as exclusive.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, no, that's absolutely right. And also the other layer of meaning besides the eternal, and I really appreciate you saying that, and it is like an oracle, is also just the sounds and just what comes through. And I will be interested actually in hearing in her own voice what that sounds like. Oh, thank you.
It may sound naive, but how famous was Freud at that point in time?
Oh, okay. He was famous. He was well known, and she had idealized men before. She had idealized women before, but more men. She knew that she was coming to the top.
She came from the top in a way that wasn't accepted.
Yeah, and yeah.
Not everybody ends up or chooses to live in a mental hospital.
Yeah.
What do you think your diagnosis is?
You know, I've thought about that a lot, and if we're going to look, what about her diagnosis? Okay, and she doesn't fit anything very clearly. Okay, she clearly had okay. Now I'm gonna use psychiatric babble to the extent that that's going to help us to grasp things about her, but without the thought of reducing her to this. She had very clear severe depressive episodes. She had hallucinatory episodes that were kind of like intermittent. At first I was thinking maybe even some sort of epilepsy. But she had longer periods where she was actively delusional. And I think at the end, it was probably some kind of depression. But with sort of an intermittent delusional disorder. But very syntonic. What fit in with her her dynamics was that she could really make use of the psychotic material, and she never seemed to have a whole lot of interest. She was sometimes isolated and independent, but she did not stand on her own 2 feet a lot. So people were taking care of her. So what you make of her, it's very hard to say. Yeah. Did you have a thought about diagnosis? Or?
Well, I wondered also what Freud thought.
You know, I don't know whether the sense Freud was worried that her mother fixation was the root of a psychosis. He was very concerned that the episode of, which I only briefly described, of seeing pictures on the wall in Corfu was an eruption of the unconscious, And he was very concerned by that. And he thought it was a dangerous symptom, and she wasn't worried about it. That was not her concern. She saw that as visionary.
Didn't he attribute the lesbianism to the mother fixation?
It's not entirely clear. He probably did.
It is within what I read.
Well, I know what, and I know.
No, I mean, but it's not in her writings.
It's not clear from her writings, and it isn't really clear since he didn't write about it. There would be the tendency to do that, but he also said to her that in the beginning we made a lot of mistakes in psychoanalysis. We thought that all women would shift their attention from the mother to the father, and now we know that some women don't. And he also said that the earliest period was the same for boys and girls and for men and women. And whatever one thinks about his theories of femininity, they were definitely in flux at this point. And whatever one thinks about his theories of homosexuality, he certainly wasn't trying to move her in one direction or another.
Yeah, he was very accepting.
Much more so than anyone else around him, than any of his disciples.
The sense, again, that I get both from the poem and from the life is that, again, they converged at a very particular time in history and in a very particular time in their lives where they could have such a mutual kind of empathy, and yet it was safe. It wasn't like love, like romantic love. It was safe. It was charged at the same time. And again, that he appreciated her as a poet, and he, the thing about him, which I know in our advertisements they said that his followers, some of his more rigid followers, he absolutely, I don't know about that part of the world. I think when we talk, I don't know about being a poet. It would have been interesting to see Freud, if we discovered the hidden poetry of Freud. I don't think so. Although now I have a great project for somebody to take one of his famous essays and put it in poetry form. That would be very interesting. I just want to say also on the astrological front, if we want to make sense of that, which I've been using since I was a kid. I'm not an astrologer, but it's an intuitive tool. And what's interesting astrologically for all you dinosaur astrological buffs is that she was a Virgo, which is mutable earth, and he is a Taurus, which is fixed earth. And you had, the feel I get with this is they were both coming from the same element, and earth is, I like the plan. What's the system, Jack? And he had his, and the earth is also considered the feminine side, which, so Freud in a way was perhaps with her more nurturing and more of a maternal kind of person. Mm-hmm. If we're talking about energy and her energy versus his energy, and you were saying, the mutability and the round and roundness of the sounds and stuff, probably, I think rather than maybe it exhausted Freud sometimes, but also enlivened him.
Yes, definitely really enlivened him. Yes. Yeah. There was a question over there.
I hear her.
You don't hear her loving him.
I don't hear her loving him. I hear her loving that he loved massively.
Very interesting.
Well, one thing
but his loving her in all kinds of different ways. His being interested, his being admiring, his all of that. But I don't think.
Well, I'm telling you this, but I don't mean this as a rebuttal. She told him that if she could die instead of him, that she would do so, if he could live longer. Oh, yeah. No, it's an association. Yeah. And it may be that she would prefer to have the admiration for her live on beyond her.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, yeah. Go on.
He asked her at one point, was your father a cold man? And at least one of the people who wrote about this said that he was being deliberately warm to help her with that, to try to be a different kind of man than her father had been. Now, all of this is completely against how he said that you should practice. Now, on the other hand, and maybe somebody will help me with this one of these days, because I don't know whether this actually is something he wrote or whether I invented it. But I seem to have read somewhere in one of his letters that he had an alternate system of technique, which would use feelings instead of and in addition to interpretation, which is exactly what modern analysis does. And I don't know whether I dreamed that up and it's a wish fulfillment or whether it's buried somewhere in the Fleece letters and I haven't been able to find it. But if anyone ever finds that, please let me know. But in this treatment, he definitely seems to be using himself in a different sort of way. And he did say that in analysis we sometimes have to blend the gold of interpretation with the brass of suggestion. But it seems here that the suggestion, the relationship, is a lot more than brass. Yes?
Isn't it possible, from a countertransference point of view, that he detected her mother and father hunger, and he detected perhaps a budding psychosis, and was working analytically with the evolving psychotic personality who was starved for both mother and hunger love?
I would say absolutely. What I wonder is how much was conscious and deliberate and how much was intuitive, given that his writings about what the analyst's feelings should contribute were so parsimonious. But it certainly looks that way to me, that it was deliberate.
I think that in certain biographies of Freud, maybe even Peter Gay's biography, points out, I think, that yes, Freud's technique was a lot more like forensics in the consulting room
Yes.
than it was in the papers that he wrote and delivered.
And argued about with forensic. Right. Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
I just want to go back for a minute to, her love for him, because I'm looking at this part of the stanza, not man, not men, only one, the old man, sacred to God. So I think it was you or somebody saying, he made, Freud was God on one hand, and yet Freud was dying, so he was obviously mortal.
She actually described him to Kenneth McPherson, the male in the Menage, as why he's just Christ after the resurrection.
Yeah.
So the male-female thing, and I don't have this all formulated, but this whole idea of woman is perfect. When you said intuition on Freud's part, the dog story, when she first came in, what was left out in the presentation was that she wasn't being defiant. He said to her, don't touch the dog, he's bad with strangers.
Mm-hmm.
She felt that she had an intuition, a wisdom, a knowledge that he did not have.
Right.
That's often thought of as female, the intuition.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of not, if man is great, man is not greater than woman. Woman is as great as man. I think is part of it. Part of it in poetry, when she talks about the narcissus bud
yes.
coming through the air, that she references man's strength.
Yes.
But here's something that is so delicate, so new, that has such power to break through the soil of the earth.
Yes. Yes.
And
Where is
that's
your
really
man's strength?
Where is your man's strength?
Right. Perfect. Yeah. Yeah.
The question about how she loved, which in her life was absolutely fluid, good for her, something that we all might aspire to, and that I hear her loving the shared space. I hear her, that's what she entered, even when she's at the dog. She's like, no, I'm not a stranger. And it seems like they both did a join and did a mirror.
Right.
And that it influenced both of them. And the idea that Freud wants someone to bring something to him, well, obviously she did.
Right.
Or he wouldn't have, I guess, continued working with her.
But go on. But then when you think of the tension in the room, his first reaction is, "You're disappointed in me." She starts to cry. I mean, what a complex emotional interaction to happen between two people who have just met with a dog in the room. You know? You know? Amazing. Well, anything else? I think we're coming on time, right?
Yeah.
Are we?
Yep.
I just wonder if she had a dog, you know, or a close relationship with a dog. growing up.
She liked what? If she had a dog?
Yeah.
She liked cats. She was very distressed that he didn't like cats so much. Her pet name, she called Briar Fido. And at one point she was talking about writing to Briar and saying he's very interested in Fido, and it's Fido Mind. Her name was Kat, K-A-T, and Kenneth McPherson was Rover because he was promiscuous. But she was very distressed that he didn't like cats as much as he liked dogs. And then there was a whole other thing where, to thank Briar for giving money to the Psychoanalytic Review, he was going to give her a puppy, one of the Chow puppies, and they didn't really want a puppy, and they didn't know what they were going to do about this. So this whole relationship was very complex, but she preferred cats. But she said she had a sense of dogs.
And the sense I have, the last thing we say, is that the poem is an amazing view of, not to sound woo-woo, but it's almost like a view of her soul. So poetry is a pure, undistilled, when it works, language. Her use of language and her use of, we get such a view of her experience, and of course at the same time, she's in total control of the poem in a way that she can't be in the analysis.
I hope it doesn't confuse things, but there's another piece of a poem that I didn't read that it's like the prequel to this one.
The Master. Yeah.
Okay, and this is what she wrote earlier, and the Master is almost a response to this. This was the end of a poem that was called To the Piraeus. And she writes, "It was not chastity that made me cold or fear, that my weapon, tempered in different heat, was overmatched by yours, and your hand skilled to yield death blows, might break, with the slightest turn, no ill will meant, my own lesser, yet still somewhat finely wrought, fiery tempered, delicate, over-passionate steel." So this she wrote, they think, in relationship to Ezra Pound, and it seems to me that in The Master, she is no longer concerned about her over-delicate steel being, might break. She's got Athena's spear back.
Yeah.
Yes?
Where did she write? Did she write a book about this? Or?
She wrote one book that she published that was called Tribute to Freud. She wrote another book called Advent, which I believe was published after her death, but is usually bound in the same volume. Okay? And I think that's all that she published about Freud.
This is her in all this, and she has it's a selected poems.
Mm-hmm.
Very intense.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.